The silence of a disconnected digital network is sometimes the loudest warning of a home invasion. The timeline breaks right at the threshold of the front door, leaving behind an absolute void. The quiet neighborhood suddenly transformed into an active grid of police cruisers and crime scene tape. The family could only watch as the private sanctuary of their mother was dissected by forensic teams searching for any fragment of the truth. The initial hours of the investigation were consumed by a frantic search of the immediate area. Helicopters scanned the foothills while officers knocked on neighboring doors. But the trail was terrifyingly cold. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed her whole directly from her front step. The local authorities knew they were dealing with something far more complex than a standard break-in. The blood on the porch was a silent scream, but it offered no direction. It only confirmed the violence of the departure. The real clue, the one that would crack the timeline wide open, was hidden in the digital footprints left behind. The physical evidence pointed to an attack, but the digital evidence was about to reveal a mastermind. It forces us to ask how an intruder could know exactly which wires to cut and which devices to jam. The digital footprint provided the first major shockwave of the case. On February 10th, the Federal Bureau of Investigation released security footage that turned a missing persons case into a nightmare. The video did not show a confused neighbor or a random local thief. It showed a highly equipped intruder. The footage captured an unidentified male approaching the property with a terrifying sense of purpose. He was estimated to be between 5 feet 9 inches and 5 feet 10 inches tall. He was dressed entirely in clothing meant to conceal his identity, including a ski mask that obscured his face. But it was the gear he carried that sent a chill through the investigative team. The intruder was armed. He also carried a specific Ozark Trail 25-liter backpack, a detail the authorities released, hoping someone would recognize it. This was not a smash and grab operation. The man in the footage moved with the deliberate calculation of a tactical strike. The answer does not point to a random burglary gone wrong, but to a highly calculated operation designed to vanish a human being without a trace. He approached the camera guarding the porch. He did not flinch or panic when he saw the lens. Instead, he systematically intervened with the device. At exactly 1:45 a.m., he disabled the camera. He plunged the front of the house into darkness, ensuring that whatever happened next would not be recorded. The footage ended right as the timeline broke. This reveal changes the entire complexion of the narrative. The intruder came prepared for a prolonged extraction. The 25-liter backpack was large enough to carry specialized tools, restraints, or even medical supplies. The weapon indicated a readiness to use lethal force if confronted. But who brings a weapon and a tactical backpack to confront an 84-year-old woman who requires a pacemaker? The sheer disproportion of the threat level is staggering. The neighborhood was known for its quiet streets and tight security, making the sudden digital blackout even more alarming. A predator equipped for a heavy confrontation targeted a victim incapable of fighting back. The visual of the masked armed man standing on the porch of a frail woman is a haunting image that defies basic criminal logic. The meticulous disabling of the camera proves he knew exactly where the surveillance was and how to defeat it. He did not break the camera in a blind rage, he neutralized it. This action creates the horrifying 43-minute void. He turned off the eyes of the house at 1:45 a.m. He then spent the next 43 minutes inside the property. The machine keeping her heart monitored continued to transmit until 2:28 a.m. During those 43 minutes, the armed, masked intruder was inside the house with Nancy. He had complete control over her environment. He had the time to search for specific items or to extract specific information. The intruder did not just bypass the alarms, but dismantled the very lifelines connecting the victim to the outside world. He had the time to prepare her for transport. The calculation required to spend nearly an hour inside a target location while committing a major felony speaks to a frightening level of confidence. He was not worried about the police arriving. He was not rushed. He operated in the dead of night, executing a plan that required an armed presence and specialized gear. The federal authorities releasing the footage was a desperate move to generate leads, but it also confirmed the worst fears of the community. A highly dangerous individual was walking among them, capable of orchestrating a flawless home invasion. The contrast between the fragility of the victim and the military-style preparation of the attacker is deeply disturbing. It suggests a motive far darker than simple theft. The intruder did not just want her belongings, he wanted her, and he was willing to employ extreme measures to ensure she vanished into the cold February night without a single witness. This level of sophistication is rarely seen in local crimes. The revelation of the masked intruder forces the public to confront a monstrous reality. This was a targeted operation, but why? What could possibly motivate a tactical raid on a quiet elderly woman? Drop your theories below and tell us what you think was inside that 25-liter backpack. The answer to why this heavily armed man targeted Nancy would soon emerge in the form of an alleged digital demand that elevated the case to a national crisis. By February 2nd, the authorities officially declared the situation a kidnapping. The classification shifted the entire weight of the justice system onto the local community. It was no longer a local matter. It was a race against a biological clock. Every hour that passed meant a missed dose of critical medication. The urgency was palpable, but the investigation was about to hit a wall built entirely of digital encryption and jurisdictional pressure. It suggests a predator who had studied the target extensively. The motive behind the tactical extraction finally surfaced, and it was as modern as it was ruthless. According to reports, the perpetrators sent a ransom demand. They did not ask for cash drops in secluded parks. They allegedly demanded millions of dollars to be paid in Bitcoin. This alleged demand completely transformed the nature of the crime. Cryptocurrency ransoms require technical sophistication. They are designed to bypass traditional banking flags and launder the extortion money across global borders instantaneously. Demanding Bitcoin meant the kidnappers were confident in their digital anonymity. It also proved that they knew exactly who they had taken. Nancy was not a random elderly neighbor. She was targeted because of her connections. The demand for millions indicated that the attackers had researched the financial standing of her family and their public profile. Before we step further into the shadows to dissect the timeline and the botched investigation, the pressure on the investigators grew exponentially. The national media descended on the small community, amplifying every move the police made. The local department was suddenly thrust onto the national stage, attempting to solve a high-tech crypto extortion plot while desperately searching for a fragile victim. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was involved, but the primary jurisdiction still rested with the local county sheriff. This meant that the crucial early decisions, the golden days of the investigation, were managed by a local force facing unprecedented scrutiny. The public expected swift resolution. They expected the combined might of federal and local law enforcement to track the digital ransom and locate the victim. But behind the scenes, the reality of the investigation was far less coordinated. The authorities were dealing with an invisible enemy who communicated through encrypted channels and demanded untraceable currency. The physical search yielded nothing but the blood on the porch. The digital search was stonewalled by the blockchain. The investigators had to rely on traditional police work, interviewing neighbors, pulling peripheral traffic cameras, and digging into the immediate circle of the victim that followed. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and stay updated on this active case. They needed to find someone who had given the attackers the blueprint to the house. They needed to find the leak. The intensity of a kidnapping investigation requires absolute perfection in evidence handling. Every fiber, every digital log, every physical footprint must be preserved with pristine care. When a case involves a Bitcoin ransom and a tactical intruder, the forensic evidence is often the only thread connecting the physical world to the digital criminals. The local police department set up a command center working around the clock to unravel the extortion plot. They pored over the camera data, analyzing the precise movements of the armed man. They mapped the radius of the cellular towers, hoping to catch a stray signal from a burner phone. But the sophistication of the ransom demand cast a long shadow over their efforts. The perpetrators had thought of everything. They used masks, they disabled cameras, they demanded untraceable money. The investigation felt less like a pursuit and more like a reaction to a script written entirely by the kidnappers. Every detail matters when the authorities themselves begin to stumble over the evidence. The authorities were always one step behind, waiting for the next encrypted message while the health of the victim rapidly deteriorated. The pressure to secure a safe return was suffocating. The community demanded answers. The national news anchors asked tough questions every single night. And yet the investigators had nothing solid to offer. The tactical brilliance of the abduction seemed absolute, but no crime is truly perfect. Eventually, the facade begins to crack. And in this case, the crack did not come from a brilliant deduction by a seasoned detective. It came from a catastrophic failure at the very heart of the crime scene. The handling of a crime scene is the absolute foundation of any successful prosecution. If the foundation is compromised, the entire case can collapse, even if the perpetrator is eventually caught. At exactly 1:45 a.m., the security camera guarding the front door of a quiet residence went completely dark. The 43 minutes between the camera going blind and the heartbeat fading into static hold the key to everything. In a high-stakes kidnapping where millions in Bitcoin are allegedly demanded, the integrity of the physical evidence is paramount. The local police department, under the command of the county sheriff, was tasked with protecting that perimeter. They were responsible for ensuring that the silent witnesses left behind by the intruder remained untouched. But The intense pressure and lack of experience with crimes of this magnitude began to show. With federal agents breathing down their necks and the media watching their every move, the local authorities were about to make a series of errors that would permanently stain the investigation. When a high-profile crime occurs, the initial hours are a delicate dance of preservation and procedure. Every surface, every speck of dust, and every discarded item holds the potential to unravel the mystery. The local sheriff department, under the leadership of Chris Nanos, was suddenly tasked with securing the most scrutinized property in the region. The nation was watching. Federal agencies were offering support. Those minutes represent a window where the victim was entirely at the mercy of an intruder who moved with terrifying precision, but the ground-level execution of the investigation rested squarely on the shoulders of local law enforcement. In cases involving digital extortion and tactical abductions, the physical perimeter is the only anchor the authorities have to the real world. Protecting that anchor is the most fundamental duty of the first responders. However, the execution of that duty at this particular residence quickly devolved into an unprecedented procedural disaster. The integrity of the space was compromised almost immediately. Rather than locking down the perimeter with airtight precision, the command structure seemed to fracture under the immense public pressure. Law enforcement personnel were coming and going. The boundaries between the active inquiry zone and the outside world began to blur. Then the unimaginable happened. During the critical early phase of the lockdown, when forensic technicians should have been painstakingly cataloging every inch of the property, a food delivery driver was permitted to cross the threshold. According to reports, a pizza delivery person walked directly into the secured environment. To understand the gravity of that disconnected pacemaker, we have to look at the environment the victim was living in right before the darkness fell. This was not a minor oversight. This was a catastrophic breach of protocol. A civilian carrying a cardboard box was allowed to step into a space where an armed predator had recently stood. The driver walked through the same halls where an elderly woman was systematically removed from her life. Every footstep that delivery person took potentially ground microscopic evidence deeper into the carpet or tracked foreign biological material into the space. The moment that delivery occurred, the pristine nature of the environment evaporated. Defense attorneys build entire careers on destroying cases based on contaminated evidence. If a civilian can casually stroll into the center of a federal kidnapping investigation, how can any jury trust the purity of the findings gathered there? The defense could easily argue that any fiber or footprint found later might have belonged to the delivery driver or anyone else who wandered through the unsealed perimeter. The sheriff and his deputies had inadvertently handed any future defense counsel the ultimate weapon of reasonable doubt. An 84-year-old woman living alone presents a specific profile of vulnerability. This blunder sparked an immediate wave of outrage. Former officials and legal experts began to question the basic competency of the command structure. The focus shifted away from the brilliant calculation of the attacker and settled harshly on the glaring ineptitude of the defenders. A seasoned investigator knows that you treat a location like a holy site until every conceivable clue is extracted. You do not order takeout to the front lines of an active forensic grid. The sheer absurdity of the situation added a layer of profound frustration to an already desperate search. The family was relying on these professionals to decipher the cryptic digital footprint and track down the cryptocurrency extortionists. Instead, they were forced to watch as the physical domain was treated with a shocking level of casualness. The contamination of the space meant that the silent narrative left behind by the perpetrator was permanently altered. We will never know if a crucial piece of the puzzle was kicked under a sofa. Nancy required daily medication to survive and relied on a pacemaker to keep her heart beating steadily by a delivery chute. Or, if a foreign hair was introduced to the floorboards, the physical environment was effectively neutralized as a reliable source of truth. With the physical realm compromised, the investigators were forced to pivot their attention backward. They had to look away from the contaminated present and delve into the weeks prior to the abduction. The failure to protect the perimeter meant they had to rely entirely on uncovering the intelligence network that fed the attacker. They needed to find the source of the leak that provided the tactical layout of the house. The attention turned back to the temporary workers who had populated the property in the preceding month. The logic was sound. If the external clues are ruined, you must look at the internal vulnerabilities. But the timeline of that inquiry would prove to be even more infuriating than the pizza delivery. As the days dragged on, the public assumed that every individual who had ever set foot in that house was being rigorously interrogated. Her routine was predictable, and her physical ability to defend herself was practically non-existent. They assumed that the contractors who had intimate knowledge of the layout were facing intense scrutiny from the very first hour. But the reality of the timeline was about to reveal a delay so profound it borders on negligence. The shift from a botched perimeter to a delayed interrogation would expose the deepest fracture in the entire operation. The momentum of the pursuit was stalling right when it needed to accelerate. The failure to secure the boundaries was just the first symptom of a much larger systemic paralysis. The investigators were running out of physical clues, and the digital trail was shrouded in encryption. They were losing their grip on the narrative. The fundamental rule of any manhunt is that time is the enemy. The first 48 hours are the most crucial window for gathering witness accounts and securing alibis before memories fade or suspects flee. Yet, in a case involving a massive cryptocurrency demand and a missing 84-year-old, the investigative clock seemed to freeze. Yet her home was far from a secluded fortress. It took nearly 60 days for the local authorities to begin seriously questioning the construction crews who had worked on the property. 60 days. 2 full months passed before the police systematically sat down with the very people who possessed the structural blueprint of the targeted home. This staggering delay is the true peak of the systemic failure surrounding this tragedy. During those 60 days, the individuals who knew the exact location of the security cameras, the precise schedule of the homeowner, and the specific layout of the rooms were left largely unbothered. They had 2 months to coordinate their stories if they were involved. They had 2 months to dispose of any physical tools or digital devices. The delay is not just an administrative oversight, it is a fatal investigative flaw that may have permanently sealed the fate of the case. When you connect this 60-day gap to the haunting 43 minutes of darkness from the night of the abduction, a terrifyingly clear picture begins to form. In the days leading up to the silent disruption, the house was a revolving door of temporary workers. The masked man did not just stumble blindly into the dark. He navigated the interior with the confidence of someone who held a map. He knew where the medical equipment was transmitting from. He knew how to isolate his target without triggering secondary alarms. The 43 minutes were not spent searching the dark. They were spent executing a rehearsed script. He held a frail woman inside her own walls for nearly an hour. Was he forcing her to unlock safes? Was he attempting to authorize a massive digital transfer before moving her? The fact that he could linger for 43 minutes proves he was absolutely certain he would not be interrupted. That level of certainty only comes from inside knowledge. The contractors held that knowledge. Whether one of them was the man in the ski mask or whether they sold the floor plan to an organized network, the link is undeniable. According to reports, a team of contractors had been hired to perform work on the property. By waiting 60 days to apply pressure, the authorities effectively gave the mastermind a massive head start to vanish. The delay allowed the digital extortionists to cover their tracks and watch from afar as the local department floundered. The frustration of this realization is overwhelming. The public was led to believe that a massive, sophisticated dragnet was underway. Instead, the most obvious thread, the people who were literally inside the house before the attack, was left unpulled for 2 entire months. If you find yourself enraged by this timeline and the glaring missteps of the authorities, hit the like button so we know you are tracking this injustice with us. The failure to act swiftly on the most logical lead transforms this from a tragedy of a home invasion into a tragedy of institutional incompetence. The 60 days of silence from the investigators mirror the 43 minutes of silence from the security feeds. Both were periods of manufactured darkness where the truth was allowed to slip away. The family was left waiting for breakthroughs that were never going to come because the groundwork was never properly laid. This meant that multiple individuals who did not live there had intimate access to the floor plan. The sheer audacity of demanding millions in Bitcoin relies on the perpetrators believing they are smarter than the pursuit. When the pursuit waits 2 months to ask the most basic questions that belief is validated, the masked figure captured on film was not a phantom. He was a flesh and blood criminal who utilized practical intelligence gathered from practical sources. The blueprint was there for the taking, and the authorities simply waited too long to ask who took it. This catastrophic delay forces us to reevaluate everything we know about how high-stakes cases are handled at the local level. It shatters the illusion that a federal presence guarantees a flawless process. The highest peak of this nightmare is the realization that the system designed to find her was broken from the very start. The 60-day gap is a chasm that swallowed the best chance of bringing her home safely. As the outrage settles into a cold, heavy reality, we are left looking at the fragments of an investigation that defeated itself. For 43 agonizing minutes, the house sat in a digital blind spot. They knew where the doors were located. They knew the layout of the rooms. The family deserves a relentless pursuit of justice, not a procedural disaster. The lack of urgency in those crucial early weeks will forever haunt the narrative of this disappearance. The truth was potentially within reach, but the hands of the law simply refused to grasp it until the shadow had completely dissipated. Today, the file remains agonizingly open. There is no suspect sitting in an interrogation room. There are no grand jury indictments waiting to be unsealed. The county sheriff department and the federal agents are left staring at a cold trail that was allowed to freeze over through a combination of contamination and delay. The sprawling command center has long since been dismantled, leaving behind only the hollow echoes of unanswered questions. The community that once rallied with fervent hope has settled into a quiet, lingering dread. The physical house stands empty, a stark monument to the night the invisible walls were breached. More importantly, they had the opportunity to observe her daily habits and recognize her physical limitations. The family is trapped in the cruelest form of purgatory. They are forced to live with the knowledge that the digital extortionists walked away with the ultimate leverage while the authorities stumbled through the initial response. There is no closure to be found in a cold case. There is only the endless looping replay of the known variables. They know she walked through the door at 9:48 p.m. They know the camera died. They know the medical monitor went silent. But the space between those facts is a void that no amount of hindsight can fill. The absence of a named perpetrator makes the terror feel omnipresent. Because the masked man has never been identified, he could theoretically be anywhere. The tactical precision he demonstrated means he is likely still operating hidden behind layers of encryption and anonymity. The presence of these contractors introduces a layer of tension that cannot be ignored. The millions demanded in the cryptocurrency ransom hang over the case like a dark cloud. Was the extortion merely a distraction, or was it the primary objective? The silence from the kidnappers is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the current reality. They made their demand, they executed the extraction, and then they vanished into the digital ether. The authorities are currently relying on the slow, methodical process of tracking financial anomalies and waiting for a mistake. But criminals who employ such advanced planning rarely make the kind of careless errors that lead to quick arrests. They understand patience. They understand that the media cycle will eventually move on and the public outrage will dull into apathy. The investigation is now a war of attrition. Law enforcement must sift through massive amounts of digital noise, hoping to catch a single anomalous ping or a suspicious financial transfer. It is a painstakingly slow endeavor that offers no immediate comfort to those who love the victim. A home is supposed to be the ultimate safe haven, especially for someone whose health is incredibly fragile. The reality of a botched local response has forced the federal agencies to essentially rebuild the case from the ground up. They are attempting to recreate the compromised timeline and re-interview witnesses who were ignored during the crucial 60-day window. It is an uphill battle against the relentless march of time. The physical evidence is tainted and the witness memories are degraded. The pursuit of justice has transformed into a desperate salvage operation. We are left to reflect on the fragility of our own security systems. A locked door and a surveillance camera are merely deterrents, not guarantees. When a predator is determined and well equipped, physical barriers are easily overcome. The true horror of this narrative is that it could happen again. The blueprint for a successful tactical extraction has been written, and the systemic flaws in the response have been exposed for anyone paying attention. But when strangers are constantly walking through the halls, the boundary between public and private space dissolves. The lingering unease is rooted in the fact that the system failed at every critical juncture. The perpetrator remains a faceless phantom who exploited those failures with devastating efficiency. The story does not end with handcuffs and a gavel. It ends with a quiet, empty house and a digital ledger that holds the secrets to a vanished life. The community waits, the family mourns, and the authorities continue to search the shadows for a ghost. The silence that fell over the house at 2:28 a.m. continues to echo through the years. It is a constant reminder of the 43 minutes that changed everything and the subsequent months of investigative missteps that allowed a calculated monster to slip completely out of reach. The search goes on, but the hope for a rapid resolution has long since faded. What this case teaches us about modern criminal defense and home security is profound and deeply unsettling. Every person wielding a tool or inspecting a wall is a potential observer gathering intelligence, whether intentionally or by accident. We must recognize the evolution of the digital witness. While traditional security cameras can be physically disabled or blinded, the invisible network of medical devices and smart home appliances often continues to record data. A pacemaker, a smart thermostat, or a digital assistant can provide an irrefutable forensic timeline. These devices log timestamps and network drops that map the exact movements of an intruder. The lesson here is that securing a home now requires securing a network. However, the most critical analytical takeaway from this tragedy centers on the fragility of the chain of custody. What this case teaches us about the legal system is that a compromised crime scene destroys prosecution viability before a suspect is ever caught. When unauthorized individuals cross a forensic boundary, they introduce foreign DNA and trace evidence. This is not merely a procedural misstep, it is the creation of reasonable doubt. A defense attorney will leverage a contaminated scene to argue that any incriminating evidence was cross-contaminated or planted. Nancy was surrounded by people, yet profoundly isolated in her vulnerability. The burden of proof requires absolute certainty, and a tainted environment shatters that certainty. A local department, failing to protect the physical perimeter, effectively immunizes the perpetrator against future conviction. The meticulous isolation of a location is the only shield against a defense strategy built on procedural incompetence. The legal system demands perfection from the evidence, even when the investigation is chaotic. When that perfection is lost, the truth becomes legally irrelevant. We must look at law enforcement protocols critically. The preservation of the scene is the absolute baseline of justice. If the guardians fail, the entire court apparatus is rendered powerless. The tragedy of this local county remains an open wound that refuses to heal. The failure to secure the location and the astonishing delays in gathering intelligence have left a permanent stain on the official record. She trusted that the people working in her home were professionals just doing their jobs. A frail elderly woman was taken from her sanctuary, and the system designed to bring her back stumbled over its own feet. But in the realm of high-tech extortion, there is always one final thread that criminals struggle to completely sever. The massive ransom demanded in cryptocurrency sits on a digital ledger visible to federal trackers but locked behind complex encryption. The ultimate question that could break this cold case wide open is whether those digital assets will ever be accessed. Has the Bitcoin moved? If the perpetrators attempt to cash out or transfer the funds across international borders, they will create a new digital ripple. That single transaction could be the fatal error that finally exposes the network behind the tactical raid and brings the masked intruder into the light. Hit the notification bell to catch our immediate update. The second federal agents detect movement on that digital ledger. The true crime story is far from over. See you in the shadows. She trusted the locks on her doors and the cameras on her porch. But the simple act of hiring help had unknowingly compromised her security perimeter. There was no footage of who entered. There was no footage of what they carried. The contractors had unrestricted views of her medical routines and her security setup. They saw when she was most exhausted and when she was most alert. This is not to say that a contractor is inherently dangerous, but the sheer volume of unfamiliar faces moving through the house of an elderly woman creates an environment ripe for exploitation. Someone could easily slip a window lock open while pretending to paint a sill. Someone could memorize the blind spots of the Ring camera while carrying out debris. The vulnerability was not just physical, it was structural. The daily influx of workers turned a quiet residence into a public thoroughfare, masking any malicious reconnaissance as ordinary labor. As the sun set on January 31st, the house finally quieted down. The tools were put away and the doors were locked. Then at 2:28 a.m., a far more terrifying disconnection occurred. But the unease lingered in the empty rooms. The structural integrity of her safe space had been compromised long before the sun went down. The invisible walls protecting an 84-year-old woman had been slowly dismantled from the inside out, leaving her exposed to whoever was watching from the outside. The chilling reality of an open house is that you never truly know who has crossed your threshold. For a woman requiring strict medical adherence, the presence of unknown variables is a matter of life and death. The people walking past her living room could see the exact placement of her medicine cabinet. They could note the precise model of her security system. The comfort of her own home had been quietly transformed into a blueprint for a predator. Every creak of the floorboards could have been a mental note taken by an individual preparing for the night of January 31st. A medical pacemaker inside the house lost its link to its monitoring application. The dread builds not from a sudden violent act, but from the slow, methodical observation of a defenseless life. The stage was meticulously set for an invasion that would leave no room for resistance. She was alone with her heartbeat and the unseen eyes that had already mapped out her final hours of peace. January 31st began as an entirely unremarkable day. Nancy spent her evening out and was driven home by family members. At exactly 9:48 p.m., she walked through her front door for what would be the last time. The family said their goodbyes, believing she was safe inside her locked house. They drove away, leaving her to her nighttime routine. The following morning was a Sunday. February 1st was supposed to follow the same predictable rhythm she had established over the years. By 12 p.m., her family realized she had not attended church services. This was a glaring anomaly. This was not a power outage. This was a targeted, systematic dismantling of both physical and biological surveillance. For a woman of her age and habits, missing a Sunday service without a phone call was the equivalent of a distress flare. Her family immediately drove to the residence to check on her. They expected to find her asleep or perhaps feeling slightly unwell. Instead, they found a house that was unsettlingly still. At 12:15 p.m., the family called 911. The authorities arrived shortly after stepping into a situation that immediately escalated from a welfare check to an active crime scene. The initial walkthrough of the property revealed a detail that shattered any hope of a simple misunderstanding. A forensic biological trace was found on the front porch threshold. Later confirmed through careful testing to be her blood, the stain on the concrete was the first tangible proof of violence. The narrative shifted instantly. This was no longer an elderly woman wandering off or suffering a sudden medical emergency indoors. What happens to an 84-year-old woman during 43 minutes of manufactured darkness before she is taken entirely off the grid? Someone had been at the door. Someone had breached the threshold. The presence of blood on the porch indicated that an altercation or an injury had occurred right at the boundary of her sanctuary. The timeline began to tighten around the investigators. They knew she was alive at 9:48 p.m. They knew the family found the house empty at 12 p.m. the next day. But the blood meant that an external force had intervened. The missing church attendance was not a symptom of illness, but the result of an abduction. The police immediately began treating the property as ground zero for a major felony. Every inch of the porch was photographed, and every angle of the house was scrutinized. But the sheer lack of internal struggle presented a maddening contradiction. That is the chilling question at the center of a case that has paralyzed the community and exposed the fragility of our supposed safe spaces. If she was taken by force, why was the inside of the house not completely destroyed? The absence of chaos inside suggested a chilling level of control exerted by the intruder. The perpetrator did not just kick the door down and drag her out. They managed the scene. They controlled the environment. The blood at the threshold was a slip, a momentary loss of that control. The family stood by the police tape, processing the impossible reality that a frail woman had been physically removed from her life. The questions began to multiply faster than the answers. Who takes an 84-year-old woman? How do they transport someone who requires continuous medication without drawing attention? The authorities had to pivot from searching for a wandering senior to hunting a phantom. The transition was jarring.